First of all, I'm very, very grateful to the Gramsci Foundation for inviting me. But I immediately reveal my personal embarrassment giving a talk on the history of communism related to decolonization, a topic which in which I consider myself rather inexperienced, in a good way. In front of scholars among the most important and well-known at the international level. If I dare to have some notions about the history of European colonial expansion and decolonization, at university, at school, I might not pass a first year examination in history of communism. So please, as an investigator and an investigation on trial, I will count on the court's indulgence. In any case, I have some convictions, some ideas, and I will try to explain in some time. The first thought, in my opinion, should go to the category of decolonization. Already, Saint-Paul Cox said that he does not love this word. I will say position. International historians of colonization, and not only historians from Africa or Asia, or let's say from Latin America and Australia, are now aware that the term decolonization is charged with very deep biases. It is a term that once again puts European colonialism and colonizers at the center of history. Even when it deceives historians, think they speak about the agency of the colonizer. The term independence, if one thinks of political decolonization, would be more precise. But its meaning remains too narrow, in my opinion, such as European colonialism, which lasted half a millennium and was a multi-dimensional historical phenomenon, political, military, economical, social, cultural, linguistic, gender, and so on. So decolonization cannot be understood just in terms of politics. Not even its political actors thought it that way, as they spoke of human liberation. This necessary, almost obvious for you, widening of perspective has many consequences. The first one is chronological. If decolonization was the multidimensional historical phenomenon, even its chronology cannot be restricted in the few years between 1945 and 1960, as unfortunately we read frequently in textbooks. This is and has been the trend for decades in the international studies on the subject. Decolonization is not that great decolonization that 50 years. Decolonization in this contemporary larger sense could be identified with the history of the 20th century, 100 years. Indeed, with the history of the short century of Oxford. Exactly the same happens in many ways with the history of international communism, but I will come back to this later. The case of the decolonization of Africa explains well all this. Even in political terms alone, the decolonization of the Black continent covers a longer period than I think is sometimes a subject of conferences. Even if we can accurately indicate the events and the years of political independence of the former European colonies in Africa, if we talk about decolonization, we must talk about not events, but processes. Processes that included the origins of the movement for independence, their growth, their first defeats or setbacks, and their political victory, all in the end. Repeat, it's a story whose roots go back to the 19th century, but at least begin with the First World War. It's above all a 20th century story. The First World War, with its first scenes, during and after the sacrifice of African soldiers on the fields of the Great War, with its first divisions among nationalists, socialists, and communists after Versailles, and after the independence of Egypt, not very well remembered. With the growth of new local native ruling classes in the colonies between the two world wars, as happened for Gandhi's India. And it's strengthening, thanks to the diffusion, for instance, of the periodical press. The 20th century phenomenon with its first transnational demonstrations against the war in Ethiopia, up to the involvements in the international anti-fascist war, fought also on African soil, and its final battles for political independence after the war. So a long process. But even this was not enough. Post-colonial political regimes had to fight Africans, and even Asia, of course. Post-colonial political regimes had to fight other battles for economic independence and the decolonization of their economies. They tried it with varying results in the 60s, before and especially after 1973, with the rise of commodities, pricing commodities. In the 80s, between famines and structural readjustments asked by the International Monetary Fund, until the end of the Cold War and beyond. These battles were led by African states, of course, by the Organization of African Unity from 1963 and then from 2002 African Union, in short by Africa in general. But also by some international institutions, for example, after 1964 UNCTAD, and also by some non-African states, for instance, the socialist states, non-aligned states, and so on, albeit for special interests. Beyond these ones, for economic decolonization, there were the battles for the cultural decolonization of African countries, led together by African states, by their writers and poets, and once again by international organization and international public opinion. Of course, the struggle for political independence was the topical moment of all this, but it was not just the only one. In short, in my opinion, even these battles must be included under the category of decolonization, if you want to use it, which, if understood only in its political sense, would have too narrow a meaning. By this way, indeed, decolonization could and should be seen as a process that lasted 1 century. It is in relation to this longer and larger decolonization category that it is possible and necessary to measure the attention and the role of the communists, European communists, African communists, and communists from all over the world, not always united, as Karl Marx put, to its larger process. All the best international historiography on communism, starting from you and me, and from other scholars, has stressed the point that communism can be seen as the global political phenomenon of the 20th century. Silvio Pons, in one of his recent articles, has traced the history of communist internationalism in a book on 1917. A story, he writes, that it would not be understandable without the states, indeed in his mind the Soviet state. It also cannot be limited to those because of the strength of the transnational network of militants and parties, and we, in this first session, we began here in San. Studying the relationships between European communisms and decolonization, this second element, the transnational networks, emerged with even greater force. In order to study decolonization, it seemed necessary to decentralize the gaze, to provincialize Europe once again. It's not a novelty, but we have to. Provincialize Europe and provincialize USSR. Otherwise, why define the 20th century communism a word of words? In this sense, Old Western has made an enormous contribution to broadening the perspective by which looking at the Cold War, the second half of the century, and the role of communism in it. But in my opinion, the question is broader and covers the whole century, even its first half. Of course, nothing of all things I'm saying are new. Some of those you probably read in important books, monographs, and series like the Cambridge History of Communism, or the Oxford, the Handbook, and so on. writing the story of communists can be useful even if, in comparison to the European or Russian ones, the histories from the south of the world appear minor histories. Histories of, we have begun seeing this afternoon, histories of radical intellectuals and of minority parties and not of governments. History of struggles for the decolonization to come and the dissatisfaction from the decolonization camp that took place. Decentralizing the gaze, looking at the history of communism from the south may not be a post-colonial fashion. I don't like fashion. But an instructive lesson, a necessary lesson, both on the strengths and above all the limits of communism themselves. The history of communism as a global phenomenon, North and South are not separated, but are closely linked with each other in a relationship. The stronger when the North and the South speak to each other, the weaker when the North does not see, does not understand what happens in the South. Of course, vice versa. Of course, as you know much better than me, decentralizing the study of communism from Europe and the USSR to the world has many consequences. Not only the history of a state, but that of militant networks, not only the history of victories and electoral majorities in Italy, but the one of defeats and minorities in countries where democracy has not yet arrived. Histories of relationships of intellectuals, not with industrial working classes, as in Europe, but with huge masses of peasants. Histories not of political organization with clear-cut political aims, but histories of networks practicing, syncretizing political syncretism with long pre-modern local traditions. Paolo Capuzzo told something in this sense a few minutes ago. Seen also from the south, the world history of communism seems perhaps a story more of defeats than of victories, or of shared victories. And this sharing, I don't see anything about this, but would begin a long story studying the communism in Africa, in Asia, in the South, could not be done, in my opinion, just inside the communist studies, but in the left studies, or democratic studies, you can say, in a larger sense, but it's just a footnote. It is because all of this that it becomes a story that anticipates the reason of 1989. Looking at the history of the communism from the South, in my opinion, helps and anticipates the reason of 1989 and of the final fall of the Soviet state. Eventually, seen from the South and from decolonization, it is also history that shows perhaps more than from elsewhere, more than from the European countries of the industrial working classes, the irresistible, I can say, necessity or historical justification of a communism perceived as an aspiration to overcome social inequalities and injustice, even if not in the form of the alienation of industrial workers studied by Karl Marx, in societies, those of the Third World, which were full of them, full of inequalities and injustice. History then difficult to write and to be read, as it makes it necessary to know not so much the Russian and Chinese, that's something, but the Arabic, the Barbarian, the Nigerians, Swahili and the Africans, together with the Urdu, the Bengali, the Punjab and the Indian languages. Otherwise it's a European story. A story, it seems to me, but you are the experts, still in large part to be written. Well, after these words, probably too many words, about categories and decolonization, I would offer you some short remarks about the relationship between decolonization and communism, actually referring to Africa, but probably more general, not only Africa. these remarks came to my mind when I was asked to give this speech. And the first one was the communism and decolonization. Silvio already said a word in his introduction. Both in their wide versions coincide chronologically. The first point is that yes, decolonization began well before communism, and communism survived above all as an aspiration, and in some cases a political regime to decolonization, at least in political terms. But both in their modern forms are two great 20th century historical phenomena. In some sense they coincide. I would like to announce these 5 short, not new, sometimes paradoxical remarks, and then I will try to analyze at least one or two of them because of shortage of time. The first is, as I told you, the same time. This is the title. The same time, there exists a 20th century contemporaneity of communism and decolonization. The second is exception as a rule. As you obviously know, Karl Marx and Lenin made a rule of gaining power and seeing society and make revolutions in it. These rules were, in some sense, European rules, and even Lenin was the second revisionist, some scholars wrote. But certainly, after Lenin, Mao and the communists from the Third World made a huge third revision, because that rule, the European rule, did not work in the South. The third, we are in Italy, so I thought that Mao Zedong could be seen as the father of Enrico Berlinguer. If not Togliatti, because they had some problems. Studying the relationship between communists and decolonization, or in other words, the commitment of the different communists for national independence in Asia and Africa, is central, in my opinion, in order to understand when the pluralism of the communist national path was born. The fourth remark, East-South, as a measure of success or failure in the history of communism. Studying decolonization, it has the work of the different communists in the colonies in Asia and in Africa, helps to understand how much the history of communism cannot be reduced to the history of the Soviet state. At the ideological level, there is no doubt that the rule of communism was the dictatorship of the industrial proletariat. But at the real history level, how much did this rule, this European rule, weigh in history? And how much did the exception, the southern or oriental exception, do? The fifth remark, contradictions and necessities of communism, with some studying the history of communism from the perspective of decolonization, that is from that of the African and Asian colonial peoples, gives a contribution to understand both the limits of the success of communism in the world, but also its historical necessity as a political project to overcome social inequalities and injustice. The same times. The first remark is a chronological, as I told you. 20th century communism certainly had some distant predecessor, the Levelers, the Luddites, the Saint-Simonian scientific socialism, and so on. Similarly, the great decolonization of the 20th century has had fundamental predecessor, the American Revolution, the decolonization of Latin America, and so on. In the same way, both communism and decolonization have post-20th century successors, China, Nepal, not to mention North Korea. But if we could exclude these predecessors and their successors, the parables of international communism and decolonization almost coincide. They were born together with the First World War, and around the end of the Cold War they died, or they had some difficulties, like Groucho Marx. together. Then chronologically they coincide, albeit with opposite results. One seems to end in defeat, the other instead in victory, although incomplete. Only political independence won because of the still insufficient economic, cultural decolonization in the world. Obviously, their two curves met only partly and all in some areas of the world, but they coexisted. Decolonization, in the broad lesson I prefer, comes from the First World and Lenin and Wilson. It grows in the 20s and the 30s during Stalin. It receives important promises during and immediately after the Second World War, while the status of USSR and the other socialist countries of Eastern Europe was arising. It shows its limits after the crisis of 1973. It ended with the years 1989, 1991, while the new globalization was around. Can all these be considered just a trivial, malicious coincidence? In reality, relationship of cause and effect between the two there were. Communists outside Europe passionate for decolonization, and active native decolonizing actors generally found local and international communists as supporters. In Europe, they recognized in general African, at least by words, African and Asian decolonization movements as political subjects and friends. Now some words on exception and rule. The second remark could be no less obvious. It could sound an old discourse, but it cannot be ignored from our perspective. It refers to Karl Marx's prophecies, to the first Lenin, to the rule of Marxist communists, and to all the many exceptions to that rule. Russia was never a colony. If anything, it was a colonizing country. Nor was China ever a colony, although at the time defining it a semi-colony was the usual definition and frequent. It was a vaguely Marxist definition. China was not a political colony, but it was economically exploited through, for instance, the policy of open ports by the West and by the United States. But, contrary to all Marx's prophecies, proletarian revolution did not break out in industrial Germany, or in the United Kingdom, or even in USA, but in the pro-industrial and peasant Tsarist Russia in 1917, and then in the peasant and newly urbanized China of Chiang Kai-shek and Kuomintang in 1927. The role of the capital was set aside by the exception of Lenin, What is to be done, and of the Little Red Book by Mao. From the rule to the exception. Similarly, after the Second World War, the socialist regimes of Eastern Europe were established not by proletarian revolutions. Another exception to the rule. If all this was not enough, there were the many countries of the Southern Hemisphere, like Africa, for which between the 50s and the 70s definition of African socialism or Asian socialism or Afro-communism became in use, which turned in the reality of history, not in the skies of ideology, the exception into a rule, driving the old Marxist rule into the real true exception. In the realm of Cold War studies, as I already told, Old West had correctly emphasized its global nature, but it would be time to inorient the field of communist studies as well. Only a decentralized gaze can justify the fortune and the global dimension of communism, but doing so obliges to admit that the rule of Marx and the first Lenin was set aside by history. In the great world history spaces, African and Asian ones included, communism has established itself by fractions of cultivated intellectual small urban bourgeoisie members meeting the large peasant masses of Asian and African countries, in context where political systems were making difficult or impossible pacific political changes, often on the occasions of wars. These African and Asian exception to the European Marxist rule became in turn the rule, while the affirmation of communism in advanced industrial colonial Western countries never realized, becoming the greatest of the exceptions. This inversion between the rule and the exception did not change the fact that, as a progressive 20th century movement, communism also in the East and in Africa and the decolonized South had as its own goals modernization, industrialization, and the political mobilization of the masses. The final aim remained the same, but it was to be reached the following path different from the rule proclaimed in their ideology, with more or less coercion depending on place and time. And now just a joke about Mao father of Berlinware. One of the consequences of this inversion between the rule of ideology proclaimed in Europe and everywhere and the reality of the exception, especially in the Far East and in Africa, it is in the colonized countries, lies in the fact that the pluralism of paths the communists followed to gain power was a new rule. In the history of communism, we could say the rule came in theory from the north and from the west, but the exception, termed democratic rule, came from the south and from the east. Even putting aside for a while the Leninist exception, it is apparent that already the first strategies of the Third International for the countries of the East admitted their exception. When Mao imposed himself on Stalin by not identifying the Communist Party of China politics in the Kuomintang, another exception was already put in practice. It became enormous when in 1949 Mao took the power over China. Then Moscow, followed by the international communist movement, simply consented to it, pretending not to see the exception. Because of this change of rule, through an exception becoming a rule, leading to a rule of exception, it sounds curious that some decades after that, Moscow was so stubborn in insisting on wanting the Western European communist parties to admit a rule which by then so few respected, or had respected. If Berlinguer could affirm his pluralism, it was certainly due to the peculiar electoral force of Italian communism, but also because Mao, in certain sense, had opened the way for him. Seen not from Moscow or from Europe, but from the point of view of decolonization, the entire international communist movement was much more exceptional than normal. All this confirmed, in my opinion, the importance of decentralizing against decolonization, the colonial, post-colonial West, exception in North, are and need to be kept much more related to each other than it is normally thought. East as a measure of success. Several historians, one of them is my very appreciated friend Federico Romero, is absolutely right when he states that the Cold War, although global, Western, had Europe at its center. Falling, or with the fall of communist Europe, Moscow fell and the Cold War ended. Nevertheless, the Cold War remained global, and within its perspective, the East and the South counted much more than one might think. The post-colonial world reveals the strengths and also the many weaknesses of the communists. Their concrete pragmatism behind the appearance of rigidity, some of the reason of their final crisis. In fact, it It was the decolonized world, where communist parties were often culturally more than politically relevant, and the writings of some of the speakers explain very well this. It was the decolonized world where communist parties were often culturally more than politically relevant. To explain what before 1989, why communism had no bright future in front of it. It was the East, where except for China and very few other countries, communist regimes were not established, which measured the only partial success of communism at the global level in the 20th century. The fact was that communists, the regular and exceptional ones, armed with an ideology like Marxism, conceived for developed industrial Europe, had scarce intellectual resources capable to face the problem as first of the colonial world and then of the decolonized one. The major obstacles, it is well known, were the national question and the peace questions. Croce e delizia, we say, I don't know how English is. The major obstacles were these two relevant, very relevant questions in the Third World perspective. This was clear already at the time of the Third International, like Volkov wrote several times in his books. Then and afterwards, those two issues obliged Mao, Ho Chi Minh, the African communist socialists to innovate their communism and to invent another one, moving from the rule to the exception, turned then in a new rule. In this process of innovation and invention, these communists from the East and the South become involved with their other native cultures and political traditions. Only by this way did they rooted themselves and their parties in local political realities and cultures, localizing, if I use this word, themselves. Yet, even this was not enough to give them everywhere the victory. Perhaps they remain too much Western. This very impasse in the spread of communism in the Southern Hemisphere after the Great Decolonization had to sound the alarm of the communists, for the communists worldwide. It anticipated the fall of the war in Europe. The attempts by Eastern and Southern communists in rooting themselves in the land of decolonization, where they had often been vainly missionaries of an overly European gospel, even if adapting and changing it in 1,000 ways, up to the point of seeming unrecognizable to many co-religionists, would have had exposed some of those aporia that in Europe would have been, in the end, decisive in the final landslide. I'm going to the conclusion. Contradictions and necessities of communism. Although they rarely won as they would have liked, in the enormous variety of their countries, the Third World communists have generally been some of the best interpreters of the strong will their people had to rescue and to fight for independence, for overcoming racial prejudices, for development, for peace, for their own personal decolonization. They were among the most die-hard militants engaged in order to achieve the liberation of their countries from colonial oppression. Within the larger movements for independence and integral decolonization, when I think of larger movements, I'm thinking of the international left, international democracy. It's another speech. Within the larger movements for independence and integral decolonization, their ideas and their drive constituted an often decisive political yes. The Marxist categories they used helped them to grasp the interweaving of economic, political and cultural factors upon which colonial oppression was based. This particular attitude distinguished them within the larger liberation movements. The historical judgment on how the communists from European countries reacted to decolonization should be, on the contrary, uneven, or at least differentiated. The starting point was not so smooth. In the mid-20s, the Third International had already complained that, faced with what seemed to be the signs of a revolution coming from the East, the European communist organization, the unions, and the working people had remained somehow insensitive. In the years of the Common Forum, and more generally in the first 20 years after the end of the Second World War, that is, in the roaring phase of the Great decolonization, there was no lack of misunderstanding between European communists and Southern communists in African and Asian struggles for independence at large. But apart the general favor and the true anti-imperialist and international posture, when for the Communist Party the crucial moment to decolonize the colonial possession of their own nation came, the crises were frequent. There was crisis in France, in Belgium, in the Netherlands, in the United Kingdom. Partially different was only the situation in Italy, which no longer had its own colonies after 1943, excluding Somalia, up to 1996, and this could be one of the explanations of the position of Italian Communist Party. One explanation. The posture of the European communists operating in the colonial power was also difficult for other reasons. Inside the same internationalist and anti-imperialist front, they had to face a strong intellectual competition, at least in the analysis of issues, from other militants, the larger movement for decolonization, socialists, radicals, Catholics after the Vatican Council. These internationalists, but not communist militants, often had more daring position, more free analysis, more numerous contacts with the African and Asian militants and peoples and militants of the liberation movements than the same communists. As European communists, they did not have at all a monopoly of the right analysis of what's going on in the colonies. And often they had to chase, the communists had to chase the others. In any case, it was a part, of a broader history, not only a communist one, where tensions were not lacking among communists, socialists, Democrats, Catholics, Europeans and Africans. It was not a minor story, and it was not an easy story at all. Because of all these tensions, the position of the communists, in my opinion, was uncomfortable. This is the title of the speech. Nonetheless, in history, without their organized presence, with their political parties, and in the most diverse mass organizations, without their analysis, their efforts of analysis, without their commitment, without their victories, some, as well without their defeat, much more, neither mass mobilization for independence nor decolonization would have been possible. As historians, without taking all this into account, understanding decolonization would not be possible. And the same history of the international networks of communists would not be comprehensible. All this confirms again that in the 20th century the two histories of communism and decolonization intertwined several times on the scene of the same short century. So, I'm closing. I'm not a philosopher. I try to be a historian, and I know that we should work not only on categories, This is the field of postcolonial. They are wonderful in examining categories. Not always the same with archives, but and we should work not only on categories, but especially on sources and periodization. If I had the time, and I don't want to waste your time much more, I could have explained, I could try to explain how these rethinking categories could refresh the history of reciprocal links of communism and decolonization, make it change several times, this relation. I try to find out at least a dozen of critical juncture, critical periods, snowy, in which the connection between communist decolonization changed, probably in the doctoral lessons. I will use it. This dozen of critical junctures reveals that the relationship between communism and decolonization during all the 20th century, between communism and East, including and South, including Africa, was radically changing with time in each of these periods. And these changes do not weaken my opinion, my very general remarks. But this too would not be enough. Being a global political movement, the relevance of local situations in the history of communism and communists is paramount. Those and general junctures, critical junctures, should be declined and differentiated country by country or geographical area. Although the movement was global, each of these movements had peculiar features from country to country. All these categories, general remarks, critical junctures in time, geography, makes the picture very, very complicated. Even if for all this today, for your luck, there is no time, I hope that at least some of what I have said could help, not to reorient, but at least help your research. Eventually, pay attention to categories and very general problems could at least prevent that very detailed researches based on specific archives and sources risk to lose the general picture and underestimating the importance of careful thinking as historians about not only events but also the categories that we use in our research. Thank you.